You think hillbilly cooking was just plain and simple country fare? Think again. Appalachian kitchens produced some of the most resourceful and flavorful dinners in American history, born from hardship and perfected through generations. Let's dig into 60 old-school hillbilly dinners no one seems to make anymore. Cornmeal mush with drippings was the ultimate proof that Appalachian cooks could turn yesterday's leftovers into today's comfort. First, you stirred cornmeal into salted water until it thickened into a firm porridge, poured it into pans, and let it cool overnight. The next morning, those firm slabs were sliced and fried in hot bacon grease until the edges crisped brown and the centers stayed creamy and soft. The smell alone was enough to pull folks from their beds, as rich and tempting as any feast. Poured over with white gravy or syrup, it became a breakfast fit for a hard day's work. Families who had little knew how to stretch every grain, every drop of grease, and every bit of effort. The crackle from the skillet told them they had done it right. Cornmeal mush with drippings was more than a meal. It was a quiet triumph. It fed the body and reminded the heart that nothing had gone to waste. Each bite tasted like patience, creativity, and pride, the kind only born from making do. What began as simple porridge became a golden slice of home that fed generations through thick and thin. Pickled pig's feet were Christmas delicacy, transforming butchering scraps into something prized. When families butchered hogs in December, nothing was wasted, especially feet becoming treats after preparation. The feet were cleaned meticulously, boiled tender with bay leaves and peppercorns, then packed into stone crocks and covered with spiced vinegar heated with garlic and pepper. They cured for weeks, vinegar penetrating meat and softening cartilage until everything became tender and tangy. Served cold on Christmas morning, pickled feet were eaten with fingers, meat falling off bones while gelatinous texture melted on tongues. In rural communities throughout the South, these represented thrift elevated to tradition, using every part of hog and creating something delicious. Children learned to appreciate pickled feet as treats, not scraps. The vinegary tang cut through rich holiday meals. This proved mountain cooking was about transforming everything into something worth celebrating. Cypress knees. Stew drew its name and subtle flavor from the swampy roots of the cypress tree that lined bayou waters. Grandmothers simmered fresh fish, small shrimp, and local vegetables in a seasoned broth enriched with a few cleaned cypress knees, which released a gentle woodsy essence during cooking. The stew carried the spirit of the Louisiana wetlands, blending the sweetness of seafood with the mysterious aroma of the swamp. Served with crusty bread to soak up the broth, it warmed families after long days spent fishing or gathering along the water's edge. Children learned respect for the bayou as they watched elders harvest the knees carefully without harming the living trees. The dish reflected both reverence for nature and the inventive cooking that defined communities living close to the land. Cypress knees stew remains a rare and evocative taste of the Deep South, a recipe passed quietly from grandmother to grandchild as a celebration of place and patience. Pumpkin cornbread was a practical but delicious twist on a staple that hillbilly families relied on year-round, a quiet celebration of the harvest baked right into the batter. Adding mashed pumpkin to the mix made the cornbread softer, sweeter, and a little more festive for Thanksgiving, giving the bread a warm golden hue that fit perfectly with the season. It was an easy way to stretch ingredients and make use of whatever pumpkins the garden had produced, especially in years when crops were generous. The bread came out golden and fragrant, with a texture that landed somewhere between cornbread and cake, tender enough to eat plain but hearty enough to hold up beside stew or beans. Families ate it with butter, beans, stew, or even molasses drizzled on top, letting it fill the table with warmth. Over time, pumpkin cornbread disappeared as store-bought breads became the norm. But in homes that remember frugal cooking, it still tastes like the holidays, a dish wrapped in memory more than ingredients. Herb drying in attic rafters preserved the medicinal and culinary plants that mountain families depended on when doctors were distant and pharmacies non-existent. Scientists now confirm that slow air drying at moderate temperatures preserves the essential oils, volatile compounds, and active constituents that give herbs their power. Mountain women who hung bundles of sage, thyme, mint, and medicinal plants from ceiling beams were creating conditions that modern herb processors attempt to replicate with controlled environments. The warm, dry air circulating through attic spaces drew moisture from plant material without the heat damage that faster methods cause. Dried herbs, stored in glass jars or cloth bags, retained potency for months, providing seasoning and remedies through long winters. Food scientists studying traditional preservation now document that air-dried herbs contain higher concentrations of beneficial compounds than commercially processed alternatives. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the sound of supper sizzling in a skillet. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little grease were all you needed to turn a handful of nothing into a golden brown meal. Hillbilly kitchens loved this trick because it was fast, cheap, and never disappointed. You would drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan, listen for that familiar hiss, and wait for the edges to crisp. Hoe cakes were bread, but they were also pride. A way to make the table feel full even when meat was missing. They paired with beans, greens, and gravy, soaking up every last bit of flavor. No fork was needed, just hands and hunger. The smell alone could stop anyone passing by. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the mountain version of comfort food, simple fried perfection that spoke louder than any recipe ever could. They were proof that flavor comes from fire, patience, and heart. Souse meat with crackers was Christmas appetizer that transformed pork scraps into delicacy through careful preparation. The souse was made from pig heads, feet, and ears boiled until tender, then chopped fine and bound with gelatin from bones. Vinegar, onions, and spices were added before pressing mixture into loaf pans to set. By Christmas, the souse sliced clean, its texture firm and slightly gelatinous, its flavor tangy and rich. Served cold with saltine crackers, this was Christmas snacking that represented complete hog utilization. In mountain communities, souse meant respect for animals and refusal to waste anything. The vinegar preserved meat while adding brightness that cut through richness. Children learned to appreciate souse as grown-up food, its complex flavors marking passage into adult tastes. This was Christmas tradition born from necessity, proving that the finest cooking often came from using everything and wasting nothing. Crackling cornbread with cane syrup was Christmas side that elevated simple cornbread into something rich and celebratory. The cracklings, crispy bits of rendered pork fat left from lard making, were mixed into cornbread batter before baking, creating pockets of crunchy, porky richness throughout. The bread baked in cast iron until crusty outside and tender inside, its top golden and inviting. Served with dark cane syrup drizzled over warm slices, this combined savory and sweet in ways that defined mountain eating. In rural communities, crackling cornbread meant using every part of the hog, transforming scraps into celebration. The cracklings added protein and flavor that plain cornbread lacked, while cane syrup provided sweetness families couldn't always afford. This was Christmas abundance created from what others might discard, proving mountain cooks knew how to make luxury from nothing. Pickled beets and eggs were once a colorful sight on hillbilly Thanksgiving tables, glowing bright pink inside mason jars that sat proudly at the center of the spread. The beets gave everything a sweet earthiness, while the vinegar soaked deep into the eggs, turning them tangy and vibrant. Kids stared at them in fascination, adults reached for them with familiarity, and everyone knew exactly which aunt had brought the jar. This dish existed because nothing in a rural kitchen went to waste, especially at the end of harvest season when beets were plentiful and eggs still needed to be used. People kept jars ready weeks before Thanksgiving so the flavors could deepen, and when the holiday finally arrived, the first slice or spoonful tasted like effort rewarded. As store-bought sides became more common and fewer people kept pickling traditions alive, this once-beloved holiday treat slowly slipped away, but in some homes, a bright jar on the table still brings back memories of holidays filled with color and tang. Water glass egg preservation allowed families to store eggs for months without refrigeration by submerging them in sodium silicate solution that sealed the porous shells completely. This technique, passed through generations of mountain women, kept eggs fresh from spring laying season through winter scarcity when hens stopped producing. Modern food scientists confirm that water glass creates an airtight barrier preventing bacterial contamination and moisture loss while maintaining quality for 6 months or longer. The eggs emerged from their mineral bath looking identical to fresh ones, with yolks standing high and whites holding firm. Commercial facilities now use similar principles, but the chemistry remains what farm wives discovered through necessity. Families practicing this technique never faced winter without eggs for baking or breakfast. The method required no refrigeration, no special equipment beyond a crock, and no ongoing attention. Corn pone was a dish tied directly to survival. A cornbread stripped of luxury and made with nothing but cornmeal, water, and salt. Unlike cornbread enriched with milk, eggs, or sugar, corn pone was dense, chewy, and often cooked in a skillet or even on hot stones near a fire. It was the food of farmers, laborers, and families with little more than a sack of cornmeal to last the week. Despite its simplicity, corn pone carried dignity because it kept people alive during lean years. It was eaten plain, with beans, or crumbled into milk or pot liquor for extra nourishment. Children grew up on it, and older generations remembered it as a symbol of persistence when choices were scarce. Though not glamorous, it filled stomachs and carried people through desperate times. As prosperity grew, corn pone was replaced by softer, sweeter breads, leaving it nearly forgotten. Yet its legacy remains in the memory of grandparents who knew its importance. Corn pone tells the story of survival through simplicity, a dish that gave strength when little else could. Chestnut soup with bacon was Christmas' first course that captured forest bounty and smokehouse richness. Wild chestnuts gathered in fall were roasted, peeled, and simmered until soft enough to puree. The resulting soup was thickened with cream when available, or milk when not, creating velvety texture. Crispy bacon crumbled on top added saltiness and crunch that complemented chestnut sweetness. In Appalachian communities, chestnut soup represented Christmas before the blight destroyed American chestnuts, marking this as truly forgotten food. The soup was elegant despite humble ingredients, its nutty sweetness unlike anything modern. Served hot in bowls, it warmed bodies preparing for larger Christmas meal to follow. The bacon provided savory contrast while adding necessary fat. This was mountain sophistication, wild food prepared with technique that created restaurant-quality results, proving rural cooks understood refinement even when cooking from forest and farm. Cane syrup pie was a dessert deeply rooted in Southern sugar heritage, reflecting both thrift and sweetness. Made by blending cane syrup with eggs, butter, and a simple crust, it created a pie that was rich yet affordable. For families, it was an accessible treat when refined sugar was too costly or scarce. The deep, molasses-like flavor of cane syrup gave it a distinct taste that stood apart from other pies. Children eagerly anticipated slices at Sunday dinners or holidays, associating it with comfort and celebration. Adults valued it for how it stretched inexpensive pantry staples into something that felt indulgent. Cane syrup pie also carried cultural weight, tying households to the sugarcane fields that defined much of the Southern economy. Today, it is rarely baked, its bold flavor and simplicity overshadowed by modern desserts. Forgotten in most kitchens, it remains a reminder of Southern resilience. Cane syrup pie was more than a sweet ending. It was a testament to resourcefulness. Corn pone with molasses was one of the simplest Thanksgiving dishes, yet one that carried the most heart. Cornmeal mixed with water and a pinch of salt baked into a dense, rustic loaf that filled bellies without costing a cent. A drizzle of molasses turned it into something close to dessert, sweet and earthy with every bite, especially when the molasses thickened into sticky ribbons on the warm bread. Families ate it slowly, savoring it because it was often the only sweet thing they would taste all week. For families who did not always have sugar or store-bought sweets, this was as close to luxury as a holiday meal could get, a reminder that simplicity could still feel like celebration. It tasted like survival wrapped in warmth, a dish born from necessity but remembered with affection. As times changed, corn pone slipped away, but its spirit still echoes through every homemade cornbread recipe, especially in homes that still honor the old ways. Clabbered milk was the thick, tangy substance that formed when raw milk sat at room temperature until natural bacteria transformed it into something between yogurt and cheese. Scientists understand this spontaneous fermentation created probiotic-rich food containing beneficial bacteria that modern consumers pay premium prices to obtain. Mountain women who used clabbered milk in biscuits, cornbread, and batters were adding leavening, tenderness, and nutrition simultaneously. The lactic acid produced during clabbering created the acidic environment activating baking soda for rising, while fermentation partially digested lactose for those struggling with fresh milk. Food researchers confirm clabbered milk contained bacterial strains supporting digestive health and immune function. The process required no special equipment. Raw milk simply sat in a warm kitchen until it thickened naturally. Modern raw milk advocates now practice intentional clabbering, finally discovering what Appalachian grandmothers used for generations. Fried bologna sandwiches were the poor man's steak, but no one eating them ever complained because they hit every craving just right. Thick pink slices of bologna slapped down on a hot iron skillet and sizzled until the edges curled like little cups, blistering enough to draw out that smoky, salty bite everyone loved. The smell alone could make an empty kitchen feel full. Add a swipe of yellow mustard, a slice of onion, and 2 soft pieces of white bread, and you had a meal that worked for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It was cheap, fast, and always satisfying. Kids carried them in brown paper bags to school, and grown men packed them for long days in fields, mines, or mills. In the hills, fried bologna sandwiches were as dependable as sunrise. Simple proof that flavor never depended on price. The grease soaked through napkins, but no one minded. It was comfort food at its best. When money was thin, this sandwich filled both belly and spirit, turning hard times into something a little easier to swallow. It was fried, humble, and proud, a true taste of mountain living that never needed dressing up to feel right. Cured venison shoulder with red-eye gravy was Christmas dinner showing how preservation created celebration. The venison shoulder was cured in salt through late fall, transforming fresh meat into something that would last through winter. By Christmas, the shoulder had developed concentrated flavor, salty, slightly funky, intensely meaty. It was soaked to remove excess salt, then slow roasted until tender. The pan drippings were deglazed with strong black coffee, creating red-eye gravy, dark, slightly bitter, deeply savory. In mountain communities, cured venison meant Christmas protein that cost nothing but hunting skill and preservation knowledge. The meat was lean and dense, each slice packed with flavor that fresh venison couldn't match. Served with biscuits and greens, this was mountain fine dining earned through November hunts and December patience. The red-eye gravy cut through richness while adding complexity, proving simple techniques created profound results. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured. They just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang. The last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story. Make do and make it delicious. Fried apples cooked in an iron skillet were a Thanksgiving side that felt more like a warm hug than a dish. The apples softened slowly in butter or bacon grease, sprinkled with sugar and just enough vinegar to give them a gentle tang. They turned glossy and tender, melting into a sweet and sour mixture that tasted like fall in its purest form. Families scooped them over biscuits, served them beside roasted meat, or sometimes ate them straight from the skillet because the smell alone was too tempting to resist. Children waited with forks in hand, knowing the apples had to be eaten while they were still warm and syrupy. The sound of the skillet sizzling was a kind of holiday music, familiar and comforting. It was a dish that required nothing fancy, only patience and an iron skillet seasoned by years of use. As store-bought pies and canned fillings took over, fried apples slipped off the holiday table, but their memory lingers in kitchens where the past still matters, where the sound of a spoon scraping the skillet can bring back decades in a single moment. Salt curing meat was the ancient preservation method that allowed mountain families to store pork through entire seasons without refrigeration, using nothing but salt, thyme, and careful attention to temperature and humidity. Scientists now understand that salt draws moisture from meat through osmosis, creating conditions too hostile for bacterial growth, while allowing beneficial enzymatic processes that develop complex flavors. The careful rubbing of coarse salt into hams and bacon, the hanging in cool smokehouses, the months of patient waiting, all followed principles that food science would later explain. Mountain families who produced country hams aged for years were practicing controlled fermentation that rivals sophisticated charcuterie. The salt concentration, the temperature fluctuations, the air circulation all mattered in ways that generations of experience refined. Modern food safety researchers now study these traditional methods with genuine respect. Cushaw squash casserole was the pride of the garden before boxed meals and frozen casseroles ever came along. The long green and white Cushaw squash was peeled, cubed, and boiled until tender, then baked with milk, butter, and a touch of sugar to draw out its natural sweetness. Its mild flavor made it the perfect base for stretching a meal or feeding unexpected guests. Every household had its own version. Some topped it with breadcrumbs, others poured in cream if they were feeling fancy. The smell of baked Cushaw filled the kitchen with comfort, its soft texture melting into every forkful. It was the taste of late summer, of harvests and hard work rewarded. Hill families treated it like gold because it was both filling and forgiving, growing strong even when the soil was poor. No one ever left hungry when Cushaw casserole sat on the table. It was a dish that carried the spirit of mountain thrift, simple, slow, and made from what the land gave freely. To many, it was not just supper, but a symbol of plenty earned the honest way. Persimmon pudding with hard sauce was Christmas dessert that captured wild sweetness of mountain autumn. Persimmons had to be gathered after first frost when they became soft and intensely sweet, their astringency gone. The fruit was pressed through sieves to create smooth pulp mixed with flour, eggs, milk, spices, and molasses. Baked slowly, the pudding emerged dark and dense, its texture somewhere between cake and custard. Hard sauce, butter and sugar beaten until fluffy, flavored with vanilla or whiskey, melted over warm pudding, creating rich contrast. In mountain communities, persimmon pudding represented patience and knowledge, knowing when persimmons were ready, understanding how to preserve their flavor. The pudding was deeply spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, its persimmon sweetness unlike anything else. This was Christmas dessert that couldn't be rushed or bought, requiring understanding of seasons and willingness to wait for nature's timing. Pickled pig's feet were Christmas delicacy, transforming butchering scraps into something prized. When families butchered hogs in December, nothing was wasted, especially feet becoming treats after preparation. The feet were cleaned meticulously, boiled tender with bay leaves and peppercorns, then packed into stone crocks and covered with spiced vinegar heated with garlic and pepper. They cured for weeks, vinegar penetrating meat and softening cartilage until everything became tender and tangy. Served cold on Christmas morning, pickled feet were eaten with fingers, meat falling off bones while gelatinous texture melted on tongues. In rural communities throughout the South, these represented thrift elevated to tradition, using every part of hog and creating something delicious. Children learned to appreciate pickled feet as treats, not scraps. The vinegary tang cut through rich holiday meals. This proved mountain cooking was about transforming everything into something worth celebrating. Potato cakes made from leftover mash were a hillbilly necessity, especially after a long Thanksgiving when not a scrap could be wasted. Cold mashed potatoes were mixed with flour, onions, and sometimes an egg, shaped by hand, and fried until crisp on the outside and soft inside. They stretched leftovers into another meal, making sure no one went hungry the next day, and that nothing from the holiday table went to waste. These cakes were often eaten for breakfast with coffee, or carried out to the barn as a quick bite between chores. Rural households relied on dishes like this because they turned simple ingredients into real comfort, creating warmth from what others might throw away. Potato cakes were proof that thrift and flavor could go hand in hand, that good food did not need to be complicated. Today, they rarely appear on holiday menus, pushed aside by ready-made breakfasts and quick reheats. But their memory still brings warmth to anyone who grew up tasting them right out of the skillet, hot enough to burn your fingers, but too good to wait. Smoke preservation in small wooden smokehouses transformed fresh meat into shelf-stable protein lasting through seasons without refrigeration, using nothing but hardwood smoke and thyme. Food scientists understand that smoking deposits phenolic compounds, organic acids, and carbonyl compounds inhibiting bacterial growth while creating antioxidant protection. The slow, cold smoking techniques mountain families used, hanging hams and bacon for weeks in cool smoke, created preservation conditions that food safety research confirms prevent pathogen development. The specific woods chosen, hickory, apple, oak, each contributed different antimicrobial compounds families discovered through generations of experience. Researchers now document that properly smoked meats remain safe for months at temperatures that would quickly spoil fresh meat. The smokehouses standing in every farmyard represented food security technology refined over centuries. Commercial processors now replicate these techniques but cannot fully match them. Turnip soup with cracklins was a cold-weather favorite that smelled like home the moment it started cooking. The turnips, peeled and diced, simmered alongside their greens in a pot of salty broth until tender. Then came the cracklins, crispy bits of pork rind saved from rendering lard, added for texture and flavor. The combination of smoky, crunchy pork and soft, peppery vegetables made every spoonful feel like a reward for the day's work. This soup did not pretend to be fancy, but it filled you up and warmed you through. It was the kind of dish that made neighbors linger at the table long after the bowls were empty. For families scraping by, turnip soup was proof that the simplest ingredients could still feel like a feast. The scent of it cooking on the stove told everyone that supper was near, and all was well. It was humble, hearty, and exactly what the hills were made of. Molasses taffy pull was Christmas entertainment and dessert combined into one sticky, sweet tradition. Molasses was boiled with sugar until it reached hard ball stage, then poured onto buttered platters to cool slightly. Families gathered with buttered hands, pulling the taffy until it turned from dark brown to golden and became firm. The pulling was a social event, children and adults working together, laughing as the candy stretched and folded. The finished taffy was cut into pieces and wrapped, becoming Christmas treats that lasted through winter. In rural communities, taffy pull meant Christmas fun that cost almost nothing but created memories lasting lifetimes. The candy was chewy and intensely sweet, its molasses flavor marking it as mountain treat. This represented Christmas joy created through community effort, proving best celebrations came from working and laughing together, transforming simple ingredients into sweetness through shared labor and tradition. Cast iron bannock. Bread offered mountain travelers a quick rustic loaf that required only flour, fat, water, and an open flame. Trappers mixed the ingredients directly in a worn pan, kneading with cold hands until the dough came together in a rough round. They buried the skillet under glowing coals or set it near the fire where heat slowly baked the bread to a golden crust while keeping the inside tender and chewy. The smell of warm grain mingled with pine smoke and damp earth, giving the meal a grounding sense of place. Bannock slices served as breakfast with a smear of wild berry jam, or as the evening side to stewed meat and beans. It held up well for days, making it ideal for long treks when supplies were scarce and every meal had to be reliable. Many travelers swore the bread tasted better with each mile, as the iron absorbed stories of every camp. Modern kitchens rarely recreate that smoky, crackling crust earned only in the heart of the wilderness. Apple stack cake was the pride of Appalachian gatherings, especially around Thanksgiving. Thin layers of cake were stacked one after another, each separated by spiced stewed apples that soaked into the layers over time. It took patience to make, often shared among several women in a community, because the work was long and the reward worth it, turning the baking into a social ritual as much as a recipe. The apples were cooked down slowly, filling the kitchen with a smell that felt like the whole season condensed into a single pot. By the next day, the cake had softened into something tender, sweet, and deeply nostalgic, the layers almost melting into one another. It was a dessert that brought people together long before store-bought sweets existed, carrying the weight of family stories with every slice. Modern holidays rarely make space for a dessert that takes this much time, but those who remember it know nothing tastes quite the same, and nothing ever will. Lacto-fermentation in stoneware crocks was how mountain families preserved vegetables through long winters without refrigeration, using salt, water, and time to transform cabbage into sauerkraut and cucumbers into pickles. Scientists now understand this process cultivates beneficial bacteria, lactobacillus strains that modern probiotic supplements attempt to replicate. The fermentation creates lactic acid, preserving food naturally while producing vitamins and compounds supporting gut health. Research confirms that traditional fermented vegetables contain bacterial diversity commercial probiotics cannot match. Mountain families who ate sauerkraut with every winter meal, who drank pickle brine for stomach troubles, were practicing preventive medicine. The cool root cellars where crocks sat bubbling provided perfect fermentation temperatures that modern enthusiasts carefully monitor with thermometers. What seemed like primitive preservation was actually sophisticated biotechnology. Ash-roasted potatoes proved that even the simplest ingredient could taste extraordinary when cooked in the heart of a fire. Whole potatoes, scrubbed clean of dirt, were wrapped in damp cloth or left bare and buried beneath glowing embers. The ashes sealed in heat and smoky aroma while the skins blackened and the insides turned soft and creamy. After hours of slow roasting, mountain men raked the potatoes from the coals, brushing away soot to reveal steaming, fragrant flesh. A pinch of salt or a pat of butter transformed the humble tuber into a meal that felt almost luxurious after days of hard travel. The skin carried a subtle crunch while the interior held the essence of wood smoke and earth, a reminder of the land that provided it. Gathered around the dying fire, companions shared the potatoes with quiet appreciation, knowing that such simple food could keep spirits high and bodies strong. Few modern campfire dishes match the pure satisfaction of ash-roasted potatoes eaten under a starlit mountain sky. Wild turkey roasted with chestnut dressing was Christmas dinner that required hunting success and forest knowledge. These weren't farm turkeys, but wild birds shot in December woods, their meat darker and more flavorful than domestic fowl. The turkey was stuffed with dressing made from dried cornbread, wild chestnuts gathered in fall, sage, and onions. Roasted slowly, the bird developed crispy skin while staying moist inside, the chestnut dressing absorbing juices and becoming rich and savory. In mountain communities, wild turkey represented Christmas success. The hunter who brought one home provided real celebration. The meat was lean and slightly gamey, requiring careful cooking to stay tender. Chestnuts added sweetness and texture impossible with modern ingredients. This was Christmas earned through December mornings in cold woods, through knowing turkey habits and shooting straight. The finished bird fed extended family, its presence on the table marking genuine achievement. Pork blackberry dumplings were once a highlight of southern summers, made when berries ripened along hedgerows and farm fields. Families would gather buckets of wild blackberries, then stew them with sugar until they formed a sweet, fragrant sauce. Into this bubbling mixture, cooks dropped spoonfuls of simple dough that puffed into soft dumplings as they simmered. The result was a dessert that was both filling and joyful, capturing the taste of summer in every bite. Children loved helping pick berries, often sneaking handfuls as they worked, while adults valued the chance to turn free fruit into a crowd pleaser. Blackberry dumplings were often served with milk or cream if available, making them even more indulgent. They were the kind of dish that brought neighbors together, with everyone pitching in during harvest. Today, they have nearly vanished, replaced by store-bought pies and packaged desserts. Their disappearance is a loss of flavor and tradition, because blackberry dumplings carried with them the sweetness of both the land and the season. Kettle-cooked soup beans with ham hock were a Thanksgiving staple long before turkey became something families could count on. The beans simmered low and slow in a blackened pot, soaking up the flavor from the ham hock until the broth turned silky and rich. It was the kind of dish that filled the house with warmth even before the fire was fully roaring, a sign that the holiday had begun. Rural families relied on beans to stretch through cold weather, and having them on Thanksgiving was less about luxury and more about comfort. You could feed a whole crowd with one pot, and nobody walked away hungry. Soup beans were proof that good food did not need expensive ingredients, only time and a patient hand. Once grocery stores made turkey more affordable, dishes like this slowly faded from the holiday spotlight. But for many older families, soup beans were the real taste of Thanksgiving, hearty and honest. Spring house cooling used natural groundwater temperature to create refrigeration centuries before electricity reached mountain hollows. Scientists confirm that spring water emerges at consistent temperatures around 50 to 55 degrees year-round, cool enough to preserve dairy, meat, and produce for days longer than ambient storage allowed. Mountain families built small stone houses over springs, channeling water through troughs where crocks of butter, jugs of milk, and wrapped meat sat partially submerged. The thermal mass of stone walls, the constant flow of cool water, and the humidity created preservation conditions that modern refrigeration engineers recognize as remarkably effective. Butter stayed firm, milk stayed sweet, and fresh meat kept safely between meals. These simple structures represented sophisticated understanding of thermodynamics applied without formal education. Modern homesteaders now build spring houses following the same principles. Fried catfish with hush puppies was a supper that tasted like the river itself. Fishermen brought home catfish from muddy banks, cleaning and breading them in cornmeal before frying them crisp in hot grease. The fillets sizzled golden, their flaky flesh tender beneath the crust. Alongside came hush puppies, little cornmeal balls fried in the same skillet, crunchy on the outside and soft inside. A few onion slices and a drizzle of vinegar finished the plate. This was food for Fridays, for family gatherings, for long days rewarded by full bellies. It carried the sound of crickets and the smell of the water, the feeling of summer nights on the porch. Fried catfish was not just a meal, it was a memory that tasted like laughter, hard work, and still water. In every bite, there was pride in what was caught, cooked, and shared without waste. It was country living at its most honest, simple, and complete. Blackberry jam cake was Christmas dessert, carrying summer's wild harvest into winter celebration. This wasn't ordinary cake, but dense creation, darkened with blackberry jam stirred into batter. The jam came from wild berries picked along fence rows in July, cooked with sugar and preserved. Come Christmas, jam transformed into cake moisture and flavor, tart, sweet, purple. The batter was spiced with cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, creating warmth, complementing berry brightness. Baked in cast iron, the cake emerged dark and fragrant, its crumb tight from jam. Some families added caramel icing, others served plain. In mountain communities, blackberry jam cake represented foresight and connection to land, picking berries in summer for Christmas months away. Children remembered helping pick berries, fingers stained purple, understanding this work would become December dessert. The cake sliced thick, each piece carrying memories of summer foraging. Salt-rising bread with bacon drippings offered a rich and rustic loaf that captured the art of natural fermentation long before packaged yeast became common. Grandmothers began the process with a warm starter of cornmeal and scalded milk that sat overnight until wild bacteria created a distinct cheesy aroma. This slow magic produced a dense yet tender bread with a flavor unlike any other, slightly tangy and wonderfully fragrant. To heighten the richness, they brushed the baked loaf with hot bacon drippings, allowing the savory fat to seep into the crust and perfume the kitchen. Families enjoyed thick slices for breakfast with fresh butter or alongside hearty soups for supper. The bread required patience and trust in tradition, a lesson in letting time and nature do the work. Children woke to the smell of the loaf cooling on the counter, a scent that spoke of skill and heritage. Salt-rising bread with bacon drippings remains a beloved emblem of Southern perseverance and the quiet mastery of age-old kitchen techniques. Vinegar pie was the clever tart dessert families turned to when fruit was scarce and money even scarcer. The filling was made from water, sugar, butter, and a splash of vinegar that mimicked the tang of lemons long before citrus was easy to find in rural towns. When baked, it transformed into a silky, custard-like center with a flavor that surprised anyone tasting it for the first time. This was a pie born from ingenuity, proving that holidays did not require abundance to feel special. Families baked vinegar pie because it offered brightness in seasons when the pantry held more shadows than color. Over time, as store-bought fillings and refrigerated pies became easier to rely on, vinegar pie drifted into obscurity. But those who grew up on it still recall its unexpected sweetness and the pride of making something delicious from almost nothing. Bone broth simmering was the practice of cooking animal bones for hours or even days until the liquid turned rich, gelatinous, and deeply flavored with extracted nutrients. Scientists now confirm that this slow extraction releases collagen, gelatin, amino acids, and minerals, including calcium, magnesium, and phosphorus, in forms the body readily absorbs. Mountain women who kept stock pots simmering on wood stoves, adding scraps and bones throughout the week, were creating liquid nutrition that modern wellness companies now sell for premium prices. The gelatin supports joint health and gut lining integrity, while the amino acids glycine and proline promote skin health and immune function. Nothing was wasted. Chicken feet, pig knuckles, beef marrow bones all contributed their particular richness to the pot. Families who drank bone broth daily, used it as cooking liquid, and served it to the sick were practicing evidence-based nutrition without knowing the science. Fried green tomatoes with cornmeal crust were the South's way of saying waste nothing, because even an unripe tomato could still shine. When the vines hung heavy with fruit that would not turn red in time, thrifty hands sliced them thick, dusted them in cornmeal, and dropped them into sizzling bacon grease. The kitchen came alive with that familiar pop and crackle, the sound of hunger about to be satisfied. The slices fried golden and crisp, tart inside and smoky outside, a perfect blend of garden freshness and skillet comfort. They were often served beside beans, greens, or gravy, completing a meal that cost almost nothing but tasted like plenty. Each bite carried the flavor of hard work, sunshine, and summer's patience. Mothers never measured. They just knew when the batter was right, and kids learned to flip them when the edges turned brown. Fried green tomatoes were proof that nothing in the South went to waste. Not time, not food, not love. They were simple, dependable, and unforgettable. The first bite snapped with tang. The last ended in quiet satisfaction. In every kitchen that made them, thrift became art, and every plate told the same story: make do and make it delicious. Stack cake with dried apple filling was Christmas dessert requiring community cooperation and weeks of preparation. This wasn't ordinary cake, but thin layers stacked with dried apple filling, creating towering centerpiece feeding dozens. Women began drying apples in late summer, slicing thin and laying on screens until leathery. Come Christmas, apples were rehydrated and cooked with molasses and cinnamon until thick. The cake layers were simple: flour, lard, molasses, spices, rolled thin and baked separately. Assembly was ceremony, each layer placed and spread with apple mixture. The cake sat for days, letting flavors meld into something slicing clean and tasting like autumn. In mountain communities, stack cake represented cooperation because neighbors often brought layers to celebrations. The finished cake stood tall, dark layers visible through golden apple filling. This represented mountain Christmas, patient, cooperative, deeply satisfying. Chess pie with vinegar was one of the South's thriftiest desserts, proving that even the poorest households could enjoy something sweet. Made from sugar, eggs, butter, and a splash of vinegar, it baked into a custard-like pie with a tangy edge. The vinegar cut the sweetness, balancing the richness of the filling and making it unique. Families loved chess pie because the ingredients were always on hand, no matter how tight the budget. It was served at Sunday dinners, holidays, and gatherings, offering comfort and familiarity. While fancier pies required fruit or nuts, chess pie was humble and practical, making it beloved across generations. Children often remembered it as the dessert of their childhood, while adults prized it for its simplicity. Today, it is less common outside of heritage cookbooks, replaced by more modern sweets. Chess pie with vinegar stands as a symbol of Depression-era resilience, turning pantry basics into something remarkable. Forgotten now, it remains a dish worth remembering for both its flavor and history. Fried okra with a cornmeal crust was the crispy, golden side that completed countless hillbilly Thanksgiving plates. Fresh okra was sliced thin, tossed in seasoned cornmeal, and fried until the edges curled and the centers stayed tender. It made a soft crackle when you bit into it, releasing a flavor that tasted like a summer garden preserved for the holidays. Families served it alongside ham, turkey, or beans, and it always vanished fast. Okra grew well in mountain soil, and frying it became a beloved way to honor the harvest even as winter approached. But as frozen vegetables and packaged sides became easier, fried okra slowly disappeared from the Thanksgiving menu. Those who remember its crunch still think of it as comfort food at its finest. Rendering lard at hog killing time was the process providing mountain families with cooking fat, skin moisturizer, soap ingredient, and medicinal base, all from portions modern processing discards. Scientists now recognize that properly rendered lard from pasture-raised pigs contains significant vitamin D, healthy monounsaturated fats similar to olive oil, and none of the trans fats in hydrogenated vegetable shortening. The rendering involved slowly cooking pork fat until it liquefied, then straining into crocks where it solidified into pure white cooking fat lasting months without refrigeration. Nutritionists who once condemned lard now acknowledge that traditional lard has a better fatty acid profile than many vegetable oils promoted as healthier. The cracklins left behind after rendering provided protein-rich snacks and additions to cornbread, stretching precious resources. Mountain cooks who saved every scrap of fat were practicing waste reduction that modern sustainability advocates now champion. Fried salt pork with gravy was the kind of meal that stuck to your bones and made you thankful for every bite. Salt pork was cheap and cured, tough until you fried it just right in a black skillet. Once it crisped, the leftover drippings turned into gold, stirred with flour and milk to make creamy white gravy that poured like silk. It covered biscuits, potatoes, or anything else that needed saving from plainness. For mountain folks, this dish turned poverty into pleasure. It filled bellies after long days in the fields and made Sunday mornings smell like grace. Salt pork was often the only meat on the table, but with that gravy, no one minded. The taste was bold, smoky, and honest, like the people who made it. A plate of fried salt pork reminded everyone that ingenuity could feed a family when the cupboard said otherwise. It was poor man's steak with rich man's flavor. Venison backstrap with wild mushroom gravy was Christmas luxury harvested from November hunts and preserved for holiday feast. The backstrap was the tenderest deer cut, saved specifically for Christmas when families wanted something special. Hunters took their best bucks in late fall, field-dressed properly, and hung meat in cold sheds where December temperatures kept it fresh. The backstrap was sliced thick, seasoned with salt and pepper, then seared quickly in hot cast iron to keep inside pink and tender. Wild mushrooms gathered in fall and dried were reconstituted and cooked into rich gravy using pan drippings. creating earthy depth complementing venison. In mountain communities, venison Christmas meant rifle skill, understanding deer movement, and respect for animals giving lives to feed families. This wasn't bought meat, but earned through cold mornings in tree stands. The backstrap melted on tongue, flavor clean and sweet. Families served it with potatoes and beans. Cabbage and ham hock soup was the kind of dinner that filled both bellies and souls when times were thin and money ran out. The hock, tough and bony but rich with hidden flavor, simmered for hours until the meat fell away and the broth turned smoky. Chopped cabbage leaves, onions, and potatoes joined the pot, soaking up the taste that only slow cooking and patience could bring. The kitchen filled with steam and scent, proof that comfort was brewing even without much to spare. It was not fancy, but it fed families for days and cost next to nothing. In mountain kitchens, the secret was never waste. It was making do and making magic from scraps. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot was the sound of gratitude itself. Every bowl carried the story of thrift and resilience. A steaming ladle served on a cold evening felt like victory over hardship. Even with little meat, the broth was rich, the cabbage sweet, and the memory lasting. Ham hock soup reminded everyone that love and labor make the best seasoning of all. It was humble food, but it held more comfort than gold ever could. Moose, onion and bacon fried cabbage was one of those rustic sides that smelled so good cooking, you could follow your nose straight into the kitchen before you even knew you were walking. The cabbage wilted down in a skillet full of sizzling bacon grease, mingling with sweet onions until everything turned soft and caramelized around the edges, the kind of browning only patience can buy. It was hearty, inexpensive, and reliable. Everything a good hillbilly dish needed to be. Especially on holidays when stretching ingredients mattered, families served it beside ham, beans, or potatoes, letting its smoky flavor tie the whole meal together in a way only simple food can. It paired just as well with cornbread as it did with the main roast. Though simple, it carried the taste of holidays spent close to the hearth, where warmth came from both the stove and the people gathered around it. Today, fewer people take the time to fry cabbage the slow way, but those who remember it know it brought comfort to the table long before fancier sides arrived. Nixtamalization was the ancient process of soaking dried corn in wood ash lye water that Appalachian families learned from Cherokee neighbors and practiced for generations. The process involved mixing hardwood ashes with water to create an alkaline solution, then soaking dried corn kernels until the tough outer hulls loosened and slipped away. What seemed like primitive folk cooking was actually sophisticated chemistry that modern nutritionists now celebrate. The lye treatment released niacin otherwise locked inside the corn, preventing pellagra, a devastating disease that plagued communities eating untreated cornmeal. The alkaline bath also increased calcium and improved protein quality by making amino acids more bioavailable. Mountain families who continued this practice never suffered the nutritional deficiencies striking populations eating refined corn. Scientists now study this exact process, calling it one of the most important food innovations in human history. Those grandmothers stirring ash water were performing biochemistry. Creamed pearl tapioca was a dish that confused most people the first time they saw it, but it had a quiet charm that stuck. Grandma would cook the tiny pearls slowly until they turned translucent and soft, then fold them into a thick, savory base with cheese, onions, or even bits of ham or mushrooms. It was like a casserole crossed with a pudding. Strange, but comforting. The texture was warm and creamy, with a soft bite that held everything together. You would not find it on many dinner tables today, but back then, it was a way to stretch ingredients and use up pantry staples in unexpected ways. It was often baked until the top turned golden and set, then scooped onto the plate beside a roast or served in ramekins for something a little more refined. It had a richness that felt out of place for how inexpensive it was to make. Most people remember tapioca as a sweet dessert, but this version belonged to the savory world, and it was a world all its own. Possum roasted with sweet potatoes was Christmas dinner that filled mountain families with pride. These weren't desperate meals, but traditional feasts prepared with care. The possums were caught in late fall after feeding on persimmons and acorns. giving meat surprisingly sweet flavor. The cleaning was meticulous, with possums scrubbed thoroughly and parboiled to remove wild taste. Then they were stuffed with sweet potatoes, onions, and herbs before slow roasting in Dutch ovens. The sweet potatoes absorbed rich juices while skin turned crispy golden. In North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia hollows, Possum Christmas meant honoring traditions stretching back generations. Grandmothers taught daughters proper preparation, passing knowledge connecting families to ancestors. The meat was tender and slightly sweet. Served with cornbread and greens, this was mountain fine dining representing cultural identity stronger than judgment. Trapper's pemmican was the ultimate trail ration, dense and enduring, a food designed to keep travelers alive across endless miles of rough terrain. Hunters dried lean strips of game meat in open air or smokehouses until every trace of moisture vanished, then pounded them with stones into a fine powder. Dried berries such as chokecherries were crushed and mixed with the meat before hot rendered fat bound it all into a solid mass. Packed into rawhide bags, pemmican could last for months without spoiling, providing a powerful balance of protein and energy that fueled trappers through snowstorms and long hunts. Small pieces were eaten as is, while larger chunks could be boiled with water to create a quick stew on frigid nights. It required no fire, no cooking, only careful preparation and respect for survival knowledge passed from indigenous peoples to the mountain men who adopted it. Few modern snacks carry such history or concentrated strength, a reminder that the simplest ingredients once meant the difference between life and death on the frontier. Cornbread dressing with sage and cracklings was the sort of Thanksgiving dish that did not need a fancy name to earn respect. It started with day-old cornbread that had dried on the counter, crumbled by hand into a bowl big enough to feed whoever showed up hungry. Sage gave it that sharp holiday smell, the kind that drifted through a house long before the meal was ready, and the cracklings added salty, smoky bits that made every bite feel richer than the ingredients suggested rural families made this dressing because it used what they already had. No store-bought bread cubes, no elaborate seasoning blends, just real food stretched with care. Every pan of it tasted slightly different depending on who made it and how generous they were with the fat. Some families baked it until the edges turned crisp. Others kept it softer so the middle stayed warm and custard like before. Packaged stuffing mixes took over the country. This dressing was the heart of the table, the dish that proved you could make something worthy of a holiday without spending money you did not have. Today it has almost vanished, remembered mostly by those who still know the sound of cracklings popping in a skillet. Vinegar mother cultivation was how mountain families maintained continuous supplies of homemade vinegar using nothing but fruit scraps, water, and the mysterious living culture that transformed alcohol into acid. Scientists now understand this gelatinous mass as a symbiotic colony of acetic acid bacteria that modern fermentation enthusiasts cultivate intentionally. The process involved adding apple peels, cores, and bruised fruit to crocks of water, letting wild yeasts convert sugars to alcohol, then allowing the vinegar mother to transform that alcohol into acetic acid over weeks. The resulting vinegar contained enzymes, beneficial bacteria, and organic acids that commercial distilled vinegar lacks entirely. Mountain families use this living vinegar for preserving, cleaning, medicine, and cooking, passing down their mothers from generation to generation. Food scientists studying traditional vinegars now document health compounds that pasteurized commercial products destroy. Spinach timbales were a dish that made vegetables feel like something grand. Grandma would mix cooked spinach with eggs, cream, and a handful of breadcrumbs, pour the mixture into small molds, and bake them until they puffed and set. The result was a delicate custard-like mound that held its shape and tasted rich and savory. It looked fancy, but was often made from leftovers or frozen spinach, which made it even more impressive. These little timballs were served warm with a drizzle of cheese sauce or gravy and were a regular part of dinner parties or special Sunday meals. They had that old-fashioned air of formality that came from caring about presentation, even when money was tight. Spinach timballies were quiet showstoppers, the kind of dish that made people stop and take note without saying a word. They are rarely seen today outside of vintage cookbooks or culinary schools, But for a time, they were proof that vegetables could be elegant too. Maybe we would all eat more greens if they were served like this again. Baked sweet potatoes with butter and cinnamon were Christmas side that elevated garden staples into celebration. The sweet potatoes were stored in root cellars from fall harvest, their starches converting to sugars through winter. By Christmas, they were intensely sweet and ready for baking. Roasted whole until soft and caramelized, the potatoes were split and topped with butter and cinnamon, creating simple perfection. In rural communities, sweet potatoes represented food security. Easy to grow, simple to store, delicious when prepared well. Christmas meant breaking out the biggest, best potatoes saved specifically for celebration. The flesh was orange and creamy, naturally sweet without added sugar. Children loved sweet potatoes because they tasted like dessert, despite being dinner. This represented mountain Christmas philosophy, taking what grew easily and treating it with enough respect to make it special, proving celebration didn't require expensive ingredients when you had good land and patient hands. Cured gizzard confit transformed a humble herb drying and storage was essential knowledge that transformed summer gardens into year-round flavor sources. Grandma harvested sage, thyme, rosemary, and dill at their peak, cutting stems in the morning after dew evaporated, but before afternoon sun wilted leaves. Small bundles were tied with string and hung upside down from kitchen rafters where warm air circulated freely. Over weeks, the herbs dried slowly, concentrating essential oils into potent seasonings that lasted through winter. Once completely dry, leaves were stripped and stored in small jars away from light and moisture. A pinch of dried sage transformed bland pork, while dried mint made winter teas feel medicinal and warming. Some grandmas crushed herbs into powder, others kept leaves whole for controlled seasoning. The hanging bundles became kitchen decorations, their fragrance filling the air with reminders of summer abundance even during the coldest months when gardens lay buried under snow. Pinto bean pie was one of those Depression-era desserts that held on in rural kitchens well into the 1960s and 1970s, not because it was fancy, but because it worked. Families who grew up on hard times learned that beans could be more than supper. They could be turned into something sweet with enough sugar, spice, and patience. The filling was mashed until smooth, mixed with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a good splash of vanilla, creating a texture almost identical to pumpkin pie. People who tasted it for the first time often never guessed what it was made from, which was part of its charm. In communities where money was tight and gardens could only provide so much, this pie became a quiet symbol of ingenuity. Mothers served it proudly during Thanksgiving, reminding everyone that a good dessert did not require store-bought cans or expensive ingredients. Over time, as modern recipes took over and people became more distant from the resourceful cooking of prior generations, pinto bean pie faded. But those who remember it know it carried a warmth that came from making the best of what you had, especially around the holidays. Ash lye soap making transformed rendered animal fat and hardwood ashes into cleaning products that modern chemists now recognize as remarkably effective and surprisingly gentle. The process involved leaching water through wood ashes to extract potassium hydroxide, then combining this caustic liquid with lard or tallow in precise proportions that saponification required. Scientists understand this as a chemical reaction creating soap molecules with both water-attracting and fat-attracting ends, perfect for lifting dirt and grease. Mountain women who stirred soap kettles outdoors, testing lye strength by feel and timing the cook by experience, were performing industrial chemistry. The resulting soap contained natural glycerin that commercial manufacturers remove and sell separately, making homemade soap more moisturizing than store-bought versions. Modern artisan soap makers now revive these techniques, finally appreciating what Hillbilly kitchens accomplished. Cabbage and sausage skillet dinners were the kind that kept a family full without emptying the pantry. Smoked sausage, sliced thin, went into a hot skillet first, its fat sizzling and coating the pan. Then came chopped cabbage and diced potatoes, fried together until soft and browned at the edges. The flavors mingled, smoky and sweet, simple and satisfying. It was the perfect end to a long workday, cooked in one pan and shared straight from it. You could smell it from the porch, and it always brought folks running. The sausage might be cheap, the cabbage humble, but together they made a dinner that felt whole. Hill families loved it for being fast, filling, and made from whatever was left in the kitchen. It was comfort food that never needed explaining, a reminder that good flavor comes from care, not cost. When the skillet was empty, there was always a little left in the heart. Crackling cornbread with cane syrup was Christmas side that elevated simple cornbread into something rich and celebratory. The cracklings, crispy bits of rendered pork fat left from lard making, were mixed into cornbread batter before baking, creating pockets of crunchy, porky richness throughout. The bread baked in cast iron until crusty outside and tender inside, its top golden and inviting. Served with dark cane syrup drizzled over warm slices, this combined savory and sweet in ways that defined mountain eating. In rural communities, crackling cornbread meant using every part of the hog, transforming scraps into celebration. The cracklings added protein and flavor that plain cornbread lacked, while cane syrup provided sweetness families couldn't always afford. This was Christmas abundance created from what others might discard, proving mountain cooks knew how to make luxury from nothing. Frost grape jam thumbprint. Cookies captured the fleeting sweetness of wild grapes that only reached perfection after the first frost softened their tart skins. Grandmothers ventured into thickets to gather the small, dark clusters, then simmered them into a deep purple jam that filled kitchens with a heady autumn aroma. For the cookies, they prepared a buttery dough, pressing small wells into each round and spooning in the glossy jam before baking. As the cookies cooled, the jam set into jewel-like centers that gleamed against the golden crust. Children loved to help with the thumbprints, their tiny fingerprints leaving a family mark on every treat. These cookies often appeared at holiday gatherings when the weather turned crisp and the harvest season closed, carrying with them the taste of chilly mornings and wood smoke. Frost grape jam. Thumbprint cookies endure as a symbol of resourcefulness and celebration, a sweet way to preserve the last gifts of the wild before winter settled firmly across the southern hills. Stewed cabbage with bacon grease was the dependable side that showed up on almost every rural Thanksgiving table, not because it was flashy, but because it was steady. The cabbage wilted slowly in a skillet with onions and a spoonful of bacon grease, turning tender, glossy, and savory, the edges browning just enough to add depth. It was simple, but it was filling, and that mattered most for families who needed every dish to do real work on the plate. Families paired it with potatoes, beans, or ham, grateful for a dish that cost little but fed many, especially in years when money was scarce. The smell of cabbage cooking was as familiar as the sound of the front door opening for relatives arriving, a holiday scent that lingered long after supper ended. Today, it rarely appears on holiday spreads, but for many, it remains one of the most comforting flavors of home, tied to a past where nourishment and love were served from the same pan. Sourdough starter maintenance was how mountain families kept bread leavening alive for generations without commercial yeast, using nothing but flour, water, and the wild yeasts floating in every kitchen. Scientists now understand sourdough as a complex ecosystem of yeasts and lactic acid bacteria working together to ferment dough while producing organic acids that improve nutrition and preservation. The daily ritual of feeding the starter, keeping it warm in winter, finding cool spots in summer, all maintained conditions these microorganisms required. Mountain women who kept their starters alive through decades, passing them to daughters like precious inheritance, were cultivating something science now celebrates. Research confirms sourdough bread has lower glycemic impact, better mineral availability, and longer shelf life than commercial yeast bread. Those bubbling crocks of starter represented living technology. Sheep sorrel springs salt-curing pork was the foundation of meat preservation in mountain communities, transforming fresh cuts into shelf-stable protein that sustained families through winter. Immediately after hog butchering in cold weather, Grandma rubbed every surface of hams, shoulders, and bacon slabs with coarse salt, mixed with a little sugar and saltpeter. The salted meat was packed in wooden boxes or barrels, covered with more salt, and left in cold outbuildings for several weeks. The salt drew moisture from the meat, while penetrating deep into the flesh, creating conditions where bacteria couldn't survive. Larger cuts required longer curing times. Big hams might sit in salt for 6 weeks before being ready. After curing, excess salt was scrubbed off and the meat either hung in smokehouses or stored in cloth bags in cool pantries. Before cooking, salt pork required overnight soaking to remove excess saltiness. The practice demanded understanding of temperatures, timing, and salt quantities that varied based on meat thickness and weather conditions. Pickled eggs with beets were Christmas appetizers that added color and tang to holiday tables. Hard-boiled eggs were peeled and packed into jars with sliced beets and spiced vinegar, turning deep magenta as they pickled. By Christmas, the eggs had absorbed beet sweetness and vinegar brightness, becoming something far more interesting than plain boiled eggs. Sliced and served cold, they provided protein and visual appeal. In mountain communities, pickled eggs represented preservation skill and resourcefulness, turning abundant summer beets and everyday eggs into Christmas specialty. The eggs were firm and tangy with slight sweetness from beets. Children were fascinated by their color, adults appreciated their complex flavor. This was Christmas food that required planning and patience, proving best celebrations came from work done months earlier, transforming ordinary ingredients into something special through time, vinegar, and knowledge. Rabbit and dumplings was a meal that tasted like effort and reward mixed together, the kind that carried the story of the hunt straight to the supper table. Catching the rabbit was only half the work. The rest was done slow and steady in the kitchen. The meat was browned, simmered in broth until tender, and dropped into bubbling stock where floury dumplings waited to soak up every drop of flavor. Steam fogged the windows while the smell drifted through the house, wrapping around everyone like a promise of comfort. It was gamey, rich, and deeply satisfying, an old-world supper that turned survival into celebration. Every bite reminded folks that food earned by hand carried a different kind of pride. Families would sit quiet except for the clink of spoons and soft hums of contentment. Rabbit and dumplings filled bellies and hearts alike, warming even the coldest nights. It was country comfort at its finest, built from grit, gratitude, and a little wild luck. In mountain homes, it stood as proof that patience and hard work always paid off. The meal may have been humble, but the feeling it brought was priceless. Home, warmth, and a kind of joy you could only taste. Green beans cooked with salt pork were the long-simmered backbone of Appalachian holiday tables. The beans boiled low and slow with chunks of salted fat, turning tender and savory with every passing hour until the liquid reduced into something close to a broth and seasoning all in one. The pot would sit on the stove all morning, filling the house with a smell that signaled the holiday had begun long before anything else hit the table. These beans were not crisp or bright. They were soft, seasoned through, and comforting in the way only slow cooking can achieve. The kind of food you felt in your chest. Families paired them with potatoes, cornbread, or meat, knowing they would stretch to feed everyone who arrived, invited or not. The sound of the lid rattling on the pot was as familiar as footsteps on the porch. As quick cook methods and frozen vegetables became the norm, this tradition faded. But for many, the memory of green beans cooked down with salt pork remains a taste of home, a reminder of kitchens warmed by both food and family. Fried catfish roe was once a prized seasonal delicacy in southern fishing communities, celebrated for its crisp texture and savory flavor. When fishermen brought in catfish, nothing was wasted, and the roe was dredged in cornmeal and fried until golden. It was often served alongside hush puppies or simple greens, making a meal that felt indulgent despite its humble origins. Families valued it as a rare treat tied to the rhythms of the river, where seasonal catches dictated what appeared on the table. Children grew up with memories of this dish as a reward for long days spent fishing with parents or grandparents. It reflected a time when local waters directly fed households and traditions. Today, fried catfish roe has nearly disappeared, pushed aside by changing tastes and concerns about sourcing. Few restaurants still serve it, and many younger Southerners have never tasted it. Its loss marks a fading link between people and the waterways that once sustained them, leaving it more a memory than a menu item. Corn dodgers were a humble food that carried workers through long days in the fields or on the road. Made from cornmeal, salt, and water, sometimes enriched with lard, the dough was shaped into small cakes and fried or baked. They were sturdy, portable, and filling, making them perfect for laborers who needed food that could travel. Families packed them into lunch pails, and soldiers carried them during the Civil War, keeping the tradition alive for generations. Corn dodgers were often eaten plain, but sometimes dipped in molasses or gravy if available. They symbolized a kind of practical cooking where function mattered more than luxury. Though simple, they were tied to the rhythms of work, hunger, and endurance. Today, corn dodgers are rarely seen outside of history books or reenactments, forgotten in favor of softer breads and convenience foods. Yet their story reminds us how much people relied on ingenuity to make basic grains stretch. Corn dodgers were never glamorous, but they were dependable. Rabbit gravy over rice was Christmas dinner that stretched small game into meal feeding many. The rabbits were jointed and browned, then simmered until tender in broth thickened with flour into rich gravy. Served over white rice, this created complete meal that was economical and deeply satisfying. In mountain communities, rabbit gravy represented resourcefulness, turning 2 or 3 small rabbits into dinner for 10 or more people. The gravy was savory and rich, flavored with wild onions and black pepper. Rice stretched the meal further, soaking up every drop of gravy while providing filling carbohydrates. This was Christmas dinner born from necessity but elevated through care and proper technique. The rabbit meat was tender and mild, the gravy thick and comforting. Families gathered around steaming bowls, understanding that celebration came from making the most of what you had, transforming scarcity into sufficiency through skill and tradition passed through generations of mountain cooks. Molasses taffy pull was Christmas entertainment and dessert combined into one sticky, sweet tradition. Molasses was boiled with sugar until it reached hard ball stage, then poured onto buttered platters to cool slightly. Families gathered with buttered hands, pulling the taffy until it turned from dark brown to golden and became firm. The pulling was a social event, children and adults working together, laughing as the candy stretched and folded. The finished taffy was cut into pieces and wrapped, becoming Christmas treats that lasted through winter. In rural communities, taffy pull meant Christmas fun that cost almost nothing but created memories lasting lifetimes. The candy was chewy and intensely sweet, its molasses flavor marking it as mountain treat. This represented Christmas joy created through community effort, proving best celebrations came from working and laughing together, transforming simple ingredients into sweetness through shared labor and tradition. Skillet-fried corn was the dish that turned simple sweet corn into something unforgettable, especially when cooked in bacon grease. The kernels sizzled and popped as they hit the hot iron, soaking up all the smoky flavor and turning golden around the edges. This was not cream-style corn from a can, and it was definitely not corn baked into a casserole. It was country cooking at its purest, built on the belief that a good skillet could transform anything families served, fried corn beside everything from ham to wild game, and it held its own every time. It was sweet, salty, and rich, the kind of side that made plates a little heavier and bellies a lot happier. Modern kitchens rarely take the time to fry corn this way anymore, but those who grew up on it can still remember the sound of that iron skillet and the smell of bacon drifting through the house. Sorghum syrup production turned tall grass into sweetener when refined sugar was expensive or unavailable, providing calories, minerals, and flavor that sustained mountain communities. Nutritionists confirm that sorghum syrup contains iron, potassium, and antioxidants that refined sugar entirely lacks, making it nutritionally superior to the processed sweetener that replaced it. The process involved crushing stalks, collecting juice, and slowly cooking it over wood fires until it thickened into dark, richly flavored syrup. Scientists studying traditional sweeteners note that sorghum's complex flavor compounds reduce the quantity needed for sweetness compared to refined sugar. The crop itself grew in poor soil and dry conditions where other crops failed, providing reliable harvest when foods were scarce. Mountain families who drizzled sorghum over biscuits were consuming functional food before that term existed, Modern producers now market sorghum as artisanal sweetener. Soup beans and fatback were more than supper. They were the week's anchor. The pot would simmer all day on the stove, filling the cabin with that smoky, familiar scent of slow-cooked beans and pork fat. Fatback, a cheap cut from the back of a hog, gave those beans their flavor and a bit of grease for strength. In the Appalachian hills, this was a one-pot wonder that worked hard for families who worked harder. You could ladle it over cornbread, stretch it with onions or greens, and feed everyone until Saturday. There was pride in scraping that pot clean, because it meant you got through another week without wasting a thing. Each scoop was proof that simple food could keep you full and happy without costing much more than time. Some say it tasted like home itself, the kind of comfort no restaurant can serve. Those old soup beans told the story of mountain thrift and heart in every bite. Fried squirrel with milk gravy turned small game into Christmas celebration, tasting like hickory nuts and mountain tradition. December, squirrels were fat from fall acorns, their meat firm and flavorful. Young boys went hunting Christmas Eve morning, fathers teaching them to shoot cleanly. The squirrels were cleaned, cut into pieces, then soaked overnight in salt water. On Christmas morning, they were dredged in seasoned flour and fried in hot lard until golden crispy. Pan drippings became milk gravy, flour stirred into hot fat, then milk added slowly until thickened creamy. Families served this over fresh-baked biscuits. In Appalachian communities, Squirrel Christmas meant teaching children to hunt, to provide. Understanding food came from work. The meat was tender and slightly nutty, each piece representing hours in cold December woods. Mothers fried batch after batch, keeping platters warm. This wasn't poverty food, but tradition connecting tables to land itself. Butter churning was weekly labor that transformed cream skimmed from daily milk into the golden fat essential for baking and cooking. Grandma collected cream in crocks throughout the week, letting it ripen slightly in cool temperatures until enough accumulated for churning. The cream was poured into a wooden dasher churn or ceramic crock, and then came the rhythmic work, plunging the dasher up and down for what seemed like hours until the fat separated from buttermilk. Children often took turns at the churn, their small arms tiring before the butter finally came together in golden clumps floating in thin liquid. The butter was gathered, washed repeatedly in cold water to remove all buttermilk, then worked with wooden paddles to press out remaining moisture. Salt was kneaded in for preservation, and the butter was packed into molds or crocks for storage. The leftover buttermilk became valuable for baking. Homemade butter tasted richer and more complex than store-bought, its flavor reflecting what the cows had been eating. Sorghum sweet rolls were the kind of Thanksgiving bread that tasted like a blessing pulled straight from the land itself. The dough was soft and tender, kneaded by hand until it felt alive under the palms, then brushed with warm sorghum syrup before baking. Sorghum was a treasure in hill country kitchens, a sweetener made from tall cane that families harvested and pressed themselves, its flavor deeper and earthier than anything store-bought. When the rolls baked, the syrup caramelized on top, turning sticky and golden, filling the house with a smell that felt like autumn settling into the walls. Children hovered near the oven, waiting for the pan to come out, knowing the first roll would still be warm enough to steam in the cool holiday air. These rolls appeared on tables because they were special, but also because they were simple, made from ingredients every family kept on hand. As modern sweeteners took over and sorghum mills closed down, the tradition faded, leaving only memories of rolls so soft they pulled apart in long, sweet strands. Today they linger mostly in stories, reminders of a holiday table built on local harvest and slow, careful hands. Cast iron cooking was dismissed for decades as old-fashioned compared to modern non-stick surfaces, yet scientists now confirm what mountain cooks always knew. These heavy skillets delivered something essential beyond heat. Research proves that acidic foods cooked in cast iron absorb significant dietary iron, sometimes increasing iron content by 20 times or more. Appalachian women who simmered tomatoes, apples, and vinegar-based dishes in seasoned skillets were unknowingly treating iron deficiency anemia that plagued isolated communities. The pans themselves became supplements, leaching bioavailable iron into every pot of greens and every slow-simmered stew. Modern doctors now recommend cast iron cooking for pregnant women and children at risk of anemia. The seasoning process, coating pans with rendered lard and baking until glass smooth, created natural non-stick surfaces without synthetic chemicals researchers now question. Those heavy black skillets passed from mother to daughter carried more than recipes. Beans and chow chow relish proved that flavor did not have to cost a thing. A pot of brown beans simmered all afternoon, thickening with onions, bacon grease, and a little salt until it was pure comfort in a bowl. What made it special, though, was the chow chow, a relish made from chopped cabbage, peppers, and green tomatoes, pickled in vinegar and sugar. That tangy crunch on top of the soft beans made the whole dish come alive. It was the mountain version of balance, sweet meeting savory in every bite. Folks canned chow chow in big batches, lining up jars on the porch to cool in autumn air. It stretched plain food through the winter and turned even the simplest meal into something bright. Beans and chow chow were everyday fare, but no one ever got tired of them. It was the kind of humble magic only country kitchens knew how to make. Together they showed that good food is not about plenty, it is about knowing what to do with little and doing it well. Fried catfish with hush puppies was Christmas Eve tradition in communities near rivers and creeks. The catfish were caught through holes in December ice or from cold but unfrozen streams, their white flesh firm and sweet. Coated in seasoned cornmeal and fried until golden, the fish developed crackling crust while staying moist inside. Hush puppies, cornmeal fritters mixed with onions, fried alongside, creating complete meal. In rural communities along southern waterways, catfish Christmas Eve meant abundant local protein requiring only skill and patience to catch. The tradition often included whole community fish fries where neighbors gathered. The catfish was mild and flaky, the hush puppies crispy and slightly sweet. Served with coleslaw and hot sauce, this was Christmas celebration built on what rivers provided freely, proving holiday feasts didn't require expensive ingredients when you had knowledge, skill, and waters full of fish waiting for those patient enough to catch them. Meatloaf turned the grand harvest of the northern woods into a humble yet deeply satisfying family supper. Hunters ground coarse cuts of moose with hand-cranked grinders, mixing the lean meat with breadcrumbs, eggs if they had them, and wild herbs gathered along the trail. Packed into heavy iron pans, the loaf baked beside a wood stove or campfire until its savory aroma filled the cabin. The moose's natural richness created a flavor far deeper than beef, while the slow baking kept the meat tender and moist despite the lean texture. Families sliced thick slabs to serve with root vegetables or simply on coarse bread for hearty sandwiches the next morning. In regions where moose ranged freely, this dish marked a successful hunt and promised full stomachs for days. Today it is rare to see moose on any menu, but the memory of a golden brown loaf steaming on a rough-hewn table lives on as a symbol of skill, gratitude, and the rugged abundance of a life close to the land. Molasses-glazed country ham was a Thanksgiving centerpiece in homes where turkey was not affordable or not preferred, a dish that carried generations of tradition in every slice. The ham was salted, cured, and pan-fried or baked, then brushed with thick, dark molasses that caramelized into a sweet crust over the smoky meat, creating layers of flavor that came from time rather than cost. The smell alone could fill a house with holiday warmth, drifting into every room long before the meal began. Slices were cut thick and served beside potatoes, greens, or fried apples, creating a plate that felt rich without requiring anything fancy, the kind of feast built from what a family had rather than what they bought. Molasses was the sweetener families trusted when sugar was scarce, and using it on ham made the holiday feel special, a reminder of the harvest and the hard work behind it. As turkey took over American tables, country ham faded from the spotlight, but its tradition remains strong in the hills, where the flavor still carries the weight of memory. Haybox cooking was the ingenious method where mountain women would bring a pot to boil, then nestle it inside boxes stuffed with hay, quilts, or sawdust, and let residual heat finish cooking over hours without additional fuel. Scientists studying thermal retention now recognize this as remarkably efficient energy technology that modern slow cookers replicate with electricity. The insulation held temperatures in safe cooking range while allowing tough cuts and dried beans to tenderize slowly. Families who couldn't afford constant wood or coal used this method to produce stews, porridges, and braised meats requiring hours of cooking. Modern engineers study these principles for off-grid cooking solutions. The technique also prevented nutrient loss occurring with prolonged high-heat cooking, preserving vitamins that would otherwise break down. Contemporary chefs now use similar techniques under fancy names like passive cooking. Possum and sweet potatoes was the kind of backwoods dinner that kept families fed through the leanest winters. When hunting was luck and store meat was too dear, possum became fair game, slow roasted in the hearth until tender and rich. Paired with syrupy baked sweet potatoes, the dish filled the kitchen with a deep, smoky aroma that wrapped around every soul inside. The meat's wild flavor was softened by the caramel sweetness of the potatoes, balancing the meal just right. No one cooked it for show. It was made from necessity and served with pride. In those hills, feeding your family meant using what the woods offered, without apology or waste. Preparing it took skill, patience, and courage, the kind born from survival, not luxury. Each bite carried the taste of the land, wild and honest as the people who cooked it. For visitors, it was daring. For locals, it was life. Possum and sweet potatoes told the story of mountain living, rough, resourceful, and full of heart. It was food that asked nothing fancy, only respect for what was given and gratitude for what it provided. Sweet potato biscuits were the kind of holiday bread that felt almost magical, their warm orange glow shining through the soft dough. Made from mashed sweet potatoes mixed with flour, butter, and just enough sugar to hint at sweetness, they came out tender and fragrant every time, with steam rising the moment they were pulled apart. Families served them with syrup, country ham, or simply warm with butter melting into their centers, letting the sweetness of the potato balance the salt of whatever sat beside them. They marked special occasions because sweet potatoes were precious, and turning them into biscuits felt like turning work into celebration. The kind of recipe that required both effort and pride. Children grabbed them hot from the pan, barely waiting for the adults to sit down, knowing the first bite would be soft enough to taste like comfort itself. Over time, ready-made rolls replaced them, and sweet potato biscuits became rare, tucked away in memory rather than on the table. But their memory stays soft and golden in the minds of those who once ate them fresh from the oven, glowing with warmth and family. Root cellar food storage represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about temperature, humidity, and air circulation that modern scientists now study with sophisticated instruments. Mountain families dug into hillsides, creating naturally climate-controlled spaces, maintaining temperatures between 32 and 40 degrees year-round. These underground chambers kept potatoes from sprouting, apples from softening, and root vegetables from desiccating through entire winters. Food preservation researchers now understand that consistent cool temperatures and high humidity slow respiration and prevent ethylene damage causing deterioration. The layering techniques, storing apples away from potatoes, wrapping vegetables in newspaper, layering carrots in damp sand, reflected understanding of food chemistry textbooks would later confirm. Families maintaining these cool caverns stored enough produce to survive months of isolation. Modern homesteaders now build root cellars using these principles. Poke salad greens were a classic example of Depression-era foraging turned into food tradition, though they required care and skill. Pokeweed grows wild across the South, and its young leaves were harvested, boiled, and drained several times to remove natural toxins. Once prepared safely, the greens were fried with bacon fat or mixed into stews, providing a much-needed source of vitamins. For poor rural families, poke salad represented survival, turning something free and wild into a filling side dish. It was not glamorous, but it carried the pride of resourcefulness in desperate times. Poke salad suppers even became community events in some areas, celebrating a food that was both humble and dangerous if mishandled. Children grew up knowing that only the young leaves were safe to eat, while older parts of the plant were poisonous. Today, few people bother with the time or risk, leaving poke salad largely forgotten except in folklore. It remains a powerful reminder of how closely people once lived with the land. Wild rabbit in brown gravy was the Christmas centerpiece mountain families harvested from snowy hillsides. These were wild cottontails tracked through December snow, caught in box traps or shot cleanly. The rabbits were skinned carefully, jointed, and browned slowly in pork fat until golden. They simmered for hours with wild onions and black pepper until meat fell off the bone. The cooking liquid became rich gravy thickened with flour. Families served this over biscuits or alongside stored potatoes. In eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, wild rabbit meant Christmas protein that cost nothing, just skill and land knowledge. Children learned holiday meals came from work, not stores. The meat was tender and mild, each piece representing winter mornings spent hunting. This represented self-reliance and connection between mountain people and their environment, proving Christmas abundance didn't require money when you had resourcefulness pass through generations. Dried corn pudding was Christmas side that transformed summer's abundance into winter celebration. Field corn was dried on the cob in late summer, then cut off and stored in jars. Come Christmas, the dried corn was ground coarsely and simmered in milk with butter, sugar, and eggs until it became thick custard. The result was sweet and creamy with toothsome texture from corn pieces. In rural communities, dried corn pudding represented foresight, preserving August plenty for December scarcity. The pudding was comfort food that tasted like summer sunshine captured and held through winter darkness. Served warm, it accompanied ham or turkey perfectly, its sweetness balancing savory main dishes. This proved mountain cooks understood food preservation and flavor balance, creating dishes that honored both seasons and made winter celebrations possible through summer work and planning passed through generations. Homemade chow chow relish was a tangy, crunchy topping made from whatever the garden had left at the end of the season: green tomatoes, cabbage, peppers, onions, and anything else that needed saving. In hillbilly homes, chow chow was not an optional side. It was the finishing touch that brought beans, meats, and vegetables to life, especially during Thanksgiving when heavy dishes needed a spark of brightness. The whole process felt like a season's farewell, chopping and stewing the vegetables with vinegar, sugar, and spices until the mixture tasted both sweet and sharp. Families stored jars in cool cellars, ready to open during the holidays when fresh vegetables were long gone. Chow chow was a reminder of the garden's generosity. Even in the colder months over the decades, as supermarkets replaced home gardens, this old relish faded away. But it lives on in stories from those who remember a spoonful on top of a steaming bowl of beans. Squirrel stew was born from the woods, not the market. A family that could bring down a squirrel had meat enough for the pot, and that was reason to be thankful. Dressed, chopped, and simmered with onions, potatoes, and carrots, it became a thick, rich stew that smelled like Sunday comfort. No one thought twice about it. Hunting was just part of living. The flavor was earthy and wild, something that no city meal could imitate. Children learned early that nothing caught went to waste, and every bite carried the story of skill and effort. When times were lean, squirrel stew brought warmth, protein, and pride. It was not fancy, but it was honest and filling, the kind of food that fed both body and spirit. Around the table, folks shared not just supper, but the satisfaction of making something good from the land itself. Whole hog shoulder with crackling bread was Christmas feast requiring community effort, turning December butchering into celebration. Mountain families raised hogs specifically for Christmas slaughter, feeding them all year. The shoulder was large enough to feed extended family, fatty enough to stay moist during long cooking. It was seasoned with salt and pepper, then slow roasted over hickory coals in outdoor pits men tended throughout Christmas Eve night. Fat rendered slowly, creating crispy bark outside while inside stayed tender. women saved cracklings, crispy rendered pork fat bits, to mix into cornbread batter. The crackling bread baked in cast-iron skillets, top golden and crunchy. In rural Georgia, Arkansas, and Mississippi, this meant Christmas smelling like wood smoke for miles. Families gathered around outdoor fires, sharing whiskey and stories while meat cooked through cold night. The finished shoulder pulled apart easily, juice running into crackling bread. Okra and tomatoes with rice was a classic side dish that thrived in southern kitchens, blending garden staples into a filling, flavorful plate. Fresh okra was sliced and stewed with tomatoes, onions, and sometimes bacon fat, then spooned generously over rice. It was inexpensive and wholesome, relying on vegetables that were easy to grow in the southern climate. For families, it was a dependable dish that appeared at weeknight dinners, Sunday suppers, and potlucks alike. The combination of tangy tomatoes and tender okra gave it a unique texture and taste that many children learned to love, even if reluctantly at first. Rice made it hearty enough to stand alone when meat was scarce, adding value to a humble dish. Though once celebrated, it has slowly faded as processed foods and fast meals replaced traditional garden cooking. Today, it is remembered mainly in rural kitchens or cookbooks. Okra and tomatoes with rice remains a snapshot of how Southern cooks turned simple harvests into comfort. Crackling cornbread was the hearty, savory bread that turned ordinary cornbread into something boldly rustic. The kind of dish people remembered long after the pan-cooled pork cracklings, crispy bits left from rendering fat, were folded into the batter, adding bursts of salty richness to every slice, a reminder that nothing in a hard-working kitchen ever went to waste. The cornbread baked up golden and firm, perfect for sopping gravy or pairing with beans, each bite carrying the taste of the hog that had fed the family through winter. Families prized it because it used every part of the hog, proving once again the creativity behind hillbilly cooking. The cracklings added texture and flavor that felt like a celebration of the year's hard work, a reward for the labor it took to fill smokehouses and pantries. As diets changed and fewer people rendered their own pork, crackling cornbread became rare. But those who remember it can still taste the crunch, the salt, and the comfort baked into every bite, a flavor tied to tradition as tightly as any holiday memory. Homestead potato hash turned scraps and simple staples into a skillet full of comfort and sustenance. Settlers diced leftover smoked meat, onions, and hearty potatoes, frying everything together in hot cast iron until the edges crisped and the flavors blended into one savory bite. Early risers loved the way the scent of onions and sizzling pork filled the cold morning air, promising warmth and strength for long hours of labor. Sometimes wild herbs or a handful of garden peppers were tossed in for color and heat, but the beauty of this hash lay in its flexibility. It stretched scarce supplies, used every scrap, and satisfied appetites after hunting trips or timber work. Children often hovered near the stove, hoping for the crunchy bits at the bottom of the pan. Though modern diners may call it brunch fare, the original homestead version was a lifeline, a meal that proved how creativity and careful use of leftovers could turn the humblest ingredients into something worthy of a family gathering after a hard day. Fried rabbit sausage with buttermilk biscuits was Christmas breakfast that turned wild game into something special enough for holiday morning. Mountain families ground rabbit meat with pork fat, sage, black pepper, and salt, forming patties that fried crispy in cast iron. The sausage was lean from rabbit but rich from pork fat, creating perfect balance. Served alongside buttermilk biscuits, split and buttered, this was breakfast that required hunting skill and butchering knowledge. In Appalachian communities, Christmas morning meant rabbit sausage sizzling while biscuits baked, filling houses with savory smells. Children woke to this aroma, understanding Christmas began with food earned through work. The sausage was tender inside with crackling crust outside, its sage flavor marking it as celebration food. This represented mountain Christmas, wild game transformed into tradition, poverty turned into pride through skill and resourcefulness. Venison stew with root vegetables was the kind of meal that made a long winter seem shorter. Hunters would bring home venison from the woods, a prize that stretched through the week when cooked right. The meat was browned slow, then left to simmer for hours with onions, carrots, and potatoes until the broth turned rich and thick. The smell filled every corner of the cabin, carrying the promise of warmth and rest after a hard day's work. Venison had a deep flavor that no store-bought cut could match, wild and honest like the hills themselves. Every bite was hearty enough to chase off the chill of mountain nights. It was not just food, it was gratitude, a reminder that skill and patience could turn the wilderness into supper. Families gathered close around the table, steam rising from their bowls, and silence replaced talk as the first spoonfuls hit the tongue. This stew was more than survival. It was tradition simmered slow, memory served warm, and pride eaten clean to the last bite. Brown beans and fried taters were the quiet backbone of many hillbilly Thanksgivings, especially in homes where simple food meant everything. The beans simmered low with salt and maybe a bit of fat, turning creamy as they cooked and filling the kitchen with a gentle, earthy aroma. The potatoes sizzled in a skillet until the edges crisped and browned, popping softly as they hit the hot grease. Together they made a meal that warmed the body and steadied the heart, the kind of food that reminded families what real comfort tasted like. Some households served them as a starter, others as part of the main meal, but in every home they were welcomed with gratitude. Families served them before the main meal or right beside it, grateful for food that filled stomachs without costing much. As Thanksgiving traditions grew richer, brown beans and taters slipped into the background, but their comfort never faded, especially for anyone who still knows the taste of a meal built from patience instead of price. Corn fritters with sorghum syrup were the kind of treat that made even the hardest days end on a sweet note. Fresh corn was grated right off the cob, mixed with egg and cornmeal, then dropped into hot grease until puffed and golden. Each fritter sizzled with that unmistakable sound of something good cooking. You could eat them plain with a pinch of salt, or drizzle them with dark, sticky sorghum syrup for a dessert that tasted like sunshine and soil. The syrup itself was a treasure, boiled down slow from cane juice, thick as honey and twice as rich. It was poured with care because every drop was earned through long days of turning the mill. Corn fritters were a fair reward for that labor, shared hot from the pan between laughter and stories. Their crisp edges and soft centers made them perfect for breakfast or supper alike. It was the kind of food that did not need a recipe, just memory and feeling, passed down from one careful cook to another. Simple, honest, and always satisfying. Fried apple pies with sorghum were Christmas dessert that children waited for all year. Dried apples from summer harvest were rehydrated and cooked down with sorghum syrup, cinnamon, and nutmeg until thick and jammy. The filling was enclosed in circles of biscuit dough, crimped shut, and fried in hot lard until golden and crackling. The result was handheld Christmas joy. Crispy outside, molten apple inside, sweet and spiced. In rural communities, fried apple pies meant celebration accessible to poorest families, since dried apples cost nothing but summer work. Children received these as special treats, burning their mouths on hot filling while snow fell outside. The pies were portable, lasting days without refrigeration, making them perfect for holiday visiting. Each bite delivered concentrated apple sweetness balanced by pastry crunch, proving that simplest ingredients could create genuine luxury when prepared with care and love passed through generations. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the sound of supper sizzling in a skillet. Cornmeal, water, salt, and a little grease were all you needed to turn a handful of nothing into a golden brown meal. Hillbilly kitchens loved this trick because it was fast, cheap, and never disappointed. You would drop spoonfuls of batter into the pan, listen for that familiar hiss, and wait for the edges to crisp. Hoe cakes were bread, but they were also pride, a way to make the table feel full even when meat was missing. They paired with beans, greens, and gravy, soaking up every last bit of flavor. No fork was needed, just hands and hunger. The smell alone could stop anyone passing by. Fried cornbread hoe cakes were the mountain version of comfort food, simple fried perfection that spoke louder than any recipe ever could. They were proof that flavor comes from fire, patience, and heart. Dried apple butter was the kind of spread that took patience, firewood, and a whole day of quiet tending. Families dried slices of apples during the fall, storing them in cloth sacks until Thanksgiving arrived. Then the apples simmered low on the wood stove with sugar and spices until they thickened into a deep, dark paste, rich enough to cling to the spoon. The flavor was concentrated and warm, tasting like every apple of the season squeezed into a single bite. It was spread on biscuits, cornbread, and sweet rolls, turning even the plainest food into something comforting. Making dried apple butter was work, but it was the kind of work families understood. Steady stirring, adding a log to the fire, passing the pot from one set of hands to another as canned spreads filled grocery shelves and wood stoves disappeared from kitchens. Dried apple butter slipped out of everyday life. But nothing store-bought can replace the taste of apples cooked down until they reach the very heart of sweetness. Black walnut vinegar pie offered a bold finish to any meal with its intriguing mix of sharpness and deep sweetness. Grandmother's whipped eggs, sorghum syrup, and aged black walnut vinegar into a dark filling that baked into a glossy, fragrant pie. The vinegar cut through the richness, highlighting the earthy flavor of the walnuts while leaving a gentle tang on the tongue. Served slightly warm, the pie balanced sweet and sour in a way that surprised guests and delighted those accustomed to more traditional desserts. The recipe required patience, as black walnuts demanded careful cracking, and the vinegar needed months to develop its complex character. Families who tasted this pie remembered it as a treat reserved for holidays or important gatherings, a dessert that told of long preparation and old-world skill. Black walnut vinegar pie endures as a testament to the resourcefulness of Southern grandmothers who knew how to transform humble ingredients into a sophisticated dessert that lingered in memory long after the last slice disappeared. Salt-cured country ham was Christmas luxury taking months to create and symbolizing prosperity through patience. These weren't store hams, but whole hog legs cured in salt, then hung in smokehouses through fall and winter. The curing began in November, with fresh hams rubbed with salt and sometimes sugar, drawing out moisture and preserving meat without refrigeration. By Christmas, hams developed deep mahogany exteriors and concentrated salty sweet flavor, unlike anything modern. The ham was soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then baked slowly with brown sugar glaze, creating caramelized crust. Sliced thin, the meat was intensely flavorful, salty, smoky, rich, requiring only biscuits and red-eye gravy. In Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee, country ham represented wealth and foresight, since families began curing in fall for Christmas. The smell of ham baking filled houses Christmas morning. This wasn't bought but made food, requiring knowledge of salt ratios and smoking. Hog maw and potatoes was one of those meals that proved nothing went to waste in a true hillbilly kitchen. The pig's stomach, cleaned and stuffed with diced potatoes, onions, and spices, was baked slow until the filling turned soft and savory. It was not a dish for the faint of heart, but for those who understood the value of every part of the animal, it was a delicacy. The skin crisped at the edges, sealing in the flavor of the simple stuffing inside. What others might have thrown away, mountain families turned into supper. The smell that filled the house was rich, earthy, and unforgettable. Plates were cleaned, not because of hunger alone, but out of respect for the effort behind it. Hog maw and potatoes taught a lesson about gratitude and grit. That waste was a luxury poor folks could never afford. It was born from necessity but perfected through pride. For those who grew up with it, no feast ever tasted quite as real. Backbone and dumplings was Christmas comfort food that transformed butchering remnants into soul-warming celebration. The backbone, cut from hogs during December slaughter, was meaty enough to flavor broth but cheap enough for everyday tables. The bones simmered for hours with onions and black pepper until meat fell away tender. Then dumplings were dropped into bubbling broth. Flour, lard, and buttermilk rolled thin and cut into strips. They puffed up while cooking, absorbing rich pork flavor and creating thickness. In rural communities throughout the South, backbone and dumplings meant Christmas thrift elevated to tradition. Families gathered around steaming pots, spooning dumplings and tender pork into bowls. This wasn't fancy food, but it was deeply satisfying, the kind of meal that warmed you from inside while snow fell outside. The dumplings were tender and rich, the pork sweet and falling apart soft. This represented mountain Christmas, making celebration from what you had, turning necessity into tradition passed through generations. Souse meat with crackers was Christmas appetizer that transformed pork scraps into delicacy through careful preparation. The souse was made from pig heads, feet, and ears boiled until tender, then chopped fine and bound with gelatin from bones. Vinegar, onions, and spices were added before pressing mixture into loaf pans to set. By Christmas, the souse sliced clean, its texture firm and slightly gelatinous, its flavor tangy and rich. Served cold with saltine crackers, this was Christmas snacking that represented complete hog utilization. In mountain communities, souse meant respect for animals and refusal to waste anything. The vinegar preserved meat while adding brightness that cut through richness. Children learned to appreciate souse as grown-up food, its complex flavors marking passage into adult tastes. This was Christmas tradition born from necessity, proving that the finest cooking often came from using everything and wasting nothing. Wild game roast was a Thanksgiving reality for many hillbilly families long before store-bought turkey showed up regularly in rural towns. Squirrel, rabbit, and venison were the meats that fed households because they came from the land and required no money, only skill and luck. Each roast carried the flavor of the woods, slow cooked until tender in cast iron pots that never left the stovetop during cold months. Families gathered around the table, knowing exactly who had tracked the animal, who had dressed it, and who had seasoned the pot. There was pride in serving a meal earned through hard work, not purchased in a bright grocery store aisle. It might not have been glamorous, but it was honest food, and families appreciated every bite because it reflected the life they lived. Children grew up learning that a holiday meal was something you earned, not something wrapped in plastic from a grocery store. When turkey eventually became affordable, wild game roasts faded from the table, but they never faded from memory, especially for those who can still taste the smokiness of a meal that came straight from the hills. Cornbread and milk supper was what families ate when the pantry was nearly bare. A leftover wedge of cornbread crumbled into a bowl, covered with cold milk or tangy buttermilk, became dinner without complaint. It was cool and soft, with just enough salt and sweetness to feel like comfort. Hill folk did not see this as poor eating. They saw it as good sense. Every crumb mattered. Every drop of milk earned its keep. On hot summer nights, this meal kept folks full without firing up the stove again. It carried the quiet rhythm of old kitchens, simple, clean, and made from what you had. Some would drizzle a little molasses over top or sprinkle sugar if they had extra. Kids slurped it down, while elders remembered the hard times that taught them gratitude. Cornbread and milk supper was proof that even in scarcity, there was dignity, taste, and the kind of peace that only home-cooked food could bring. Boiled custard was Christmas drink that replaced expensive eggnog in mountain households. This wasn't thick custard, but pourable drink made from milk, eggs, and sugar cooked gently until it thickened slightly. Flavored with vanilla or nutmeg, it was served cold in glasses throughout Christmas Day. In rural communities, boiled custard represented accessible luxury, creating something special from everyday ingredients. The drink was sweet and creamy, coating the tongue with richness. Children loved it because it tasted like melted ice cream, while adults appreciated its elegance. Made in large batches, boiled custard lasted through Christmas week, becoming daily reminder of celebration. This proved mountain families could create holiday traditions that felt luxurious despite costing almost nothing, transforming simple ingredients through technique and care into something genuinely special that rivaled any store-bought treat families might dream of. Campfire Dutch oven. Peach cobbler turned rugged campsites into places of sweet reward after days of hard labor. Hunters or homesteaders opened precious cans of peaches saved from summer and poured them into a cast iron pot, topping them with biscuit dough mixed on the spot. The lid was covered with glowing coals, and the cobbler baked slowly as night settled over the mountains. The scent of fruit and butter rose into the cool air, drawing every tired traveler toward the fire. When the lid lifted, golden crust revealed bubbling peach syrup that dripped onto tin plates. This dessert was more than a treat. It was proof that even in the wilds, a taste of comfort and celebration was possible. Children scraped the pot clean while adults savored the rare sweetness, knowing the peaches might be the only fruit for weeks. Modern camping desserts cannot match the simple magic of cobbler baked under stars with nothing but iron, fire, and patience to guide it. Mountain-style dumplings were rolled by hand, not dropped by spoon, and that made them dense, hearty, and perfect for feeding a crowd with very little. The dough was mixed from flour, water, and fat, rolled thin, sliced into strips, and simmered in broth until they swelled into tender ribbons that turned the pot into a meal all by itself. These dumplings absorbed every bit of flavor from the pot, turning simple stock into a feast that felt richer than it had any right to be. On Thanksgiving, they appeared beside roasted meats or inside big simmering pots meant to stretch leftovers, feeding every uncle, cousin, and neighbor who showed up hungry. Making them was a tradition that brought generations together in the kitchen, hands dusted with flour, laughter mixing with the bubbling pot as stories were told for the 100th time. But as boxed mixes and quick meals replaced hand-rolled recipes, these dumplings faded from holiday tables. Those who knew them still swear nothing else fills the belly or heart quite the same, and nothing ever will. Fried apples and biscuits made kitchens smell like home long before the word comfort food existed. Dried apples were soaked and stewed with butter, sugar, and a sprinkle of cinnamon until they turned glossy and golden in the pan. The mixture bubbled low and slow, thick enough to cling to a spoon but soft enough to melt on the tongue. When spooned over warm biscuits split straight from the oven, the syrup soaked down deep into the crumb. It was part breakfast, part dessert, and all memory. Families made it on cool mornings when the stove burned early, using whatever fruit they had dried the summer before. The smell filled every corner of the house, bringing even sleepy children to the table before the first call. For some, this dish was sweeter than candy. For others, it was a reminder of simpler days when love was measured in full plates and clean pans. Fried apples and biscuits proved that comfort did not come from riches, but from the warmth of what was already there. Every spoonful was proof that sweetness could come from scarcity, and joy could come from nothing more than a hot biscuit. Sorghum gingerbread was Christmas dessert that captured dark sweetness of mountain agriculture. Sorghum syrup, made from cane grown and processed locally, replaced expensive molasses in gingerbread recipes. The result was cake that was moist, dark, and intensely spiced with ginger, cinnamon, and cloves. Baked in cast iron and served warm, it filled houses with Christmas smells that drifted through hollows. In rural communities, sorghum gingerbread meant Christmas sweetness that didn't require store-bought ingredients, since families often made their own sorghum. The cake was dense and rich, its crumb tight from sorghum's weight. Served with butter or whipped cream when available, plain when not, it satisfied sweet cravings during lean times. This represented mountain resourcefulness, creating celebration desserts from crops grown and processed locally, proving Christmas joy came from land and labor rather than stores and money. Which hillbilly dinner do you remember from your family's table? Drop your memories in the comments below, hit that like button if this brought back the taste of home, and subscribe so you never miss another forgotten favorite.